On January 6th, 2026, 5 years to the day after the January 6, 2021 riots, the Trump White House published this page on the official whitehouse.gov website. January 6th, a date which will live in infamy. They really want this thing to look spooky. I have no idea why they programmed the J6 committee to jiggle around like they have Tourette's. Maybe they thought it would make them look more evil or something? I don't know. Anyway, this website is a pure propaganda piece. It's an attempt to rewrite what actually happened on J6. And a lot of this stuff I've already gone over in my J6 video, which you really should go watch if you haven't seen it already. But now that we have an official regime timeline and interpretation of those days' events, we should check out how wrong it actually is. Here's how it begins.
President Trump took decisive action to pardon January 6 defendants who were unfairly targeted, overcharged, and used as political examples. They were not protected by the leaders who failed them. They were punished to cover incompetence. On his first day back in office, January 20th, 2025, President Trump issued sweeping blanket pardons and commutations for nearly 1,600 patriotic Americans prosecuted for their presence at the Capitol, many mere trespassers or peaceful protesters treated as insurrectionists by a weaponized Biden DOJ. He fully pardoned most, commuted sentences, and ordered immediate release of those still imprisoned, ending years of harsh solitary confinement, denied due process, and family separation for exercising their First Amendment rights.
Well, we're starting off strong with how ridiculous this all is. The number of J6 protesters range between 10,000 and 80,000 people, depending on who you ask. Secret Service and the FBI estimated that between 2,000 and 2,500 people entered the Capitol building proper. Nonetheless, just under 1,600 were actually charged with any crime at all, meaning there's hundreds of people out there who trespassed and yet they weren't charged with trespassing, either because they couldn't be identified using security footage or the charge was so incredibly minor it just didn't matter. Right-wingers like to post pictures of the J6 grandma or other people who literally did just wander around the building after everyone had been evacuated and the crowd was dispersing, in order to paint the image of all of the J6 arrestees as being this harmless. But that's just not true. Many of these people were violent. They did fight with the cops. They did break into the building using force. And their intention was to pressure Mike Pence into accepting the false electors. If you want, NPR has a full online archive of every single person charged on J6. You can see for yourself what they were slapped with, how they pled, and what punishment they received before Trump pardoned all of them. If you genuinely believe that trespassers shouldn't have been charged, even though that's kind of dumb, you can filter this archive to show only the violent rioters. And guess what? 417 people who used violence on J6 were pardoned by Trump. These are not people that were mere trespassers or peaceful protesters. These people should still be in prison. In fact, some of them have reoffended since getting released. The site continues with,
since January 6, 2021, Nancy Pelosi spent over 3 years and nearly $20 million in taxpayer funds on her partisan select committee, producing a scripted TV spectacle to fabricate an insurrection narrative and pin all blame on President Trump.
Now, this is a topic that I went over in detail in my J6 video, so I won't dwell too much on it here. The Republicans refused to fill the seats on their side of the committee, with McCarthy backing out in protest after Jim Jordan and Jim Banks were barred by Pelosi. The Republicans could have chosen other people, but they chose not to, meaning the committee was partisan because the Republicans wanted it to be, in order to discredit its work, using this very line of attack. Jordan and Banks weren't barred from the committee because they're Trump supporters. After all, Troy Nehls was allowed to sit on the committee, and he was a diehard Trump supporter. In actuality, the reason that Jordan and Banks were not allowed is because they attended the conspirators meeting on December 19, 2020. Around 20 Republican congressmen and a dozen senators met with Trump and Eastman on the afternoon of December 19, 2020, where they were briefed about procedure regarding the false electors. Everyone who attended that meeting was under investigation by the committee, making it inappropriate for them to sit on the committee.
Video and audio recordings, including unaired HBO footage from her own daughter, show Nancy Pelosi repeatedly acknowledging responsibility for the catastrophic security failures, admitting we have totally failed, and I take full responsibility for not having the National Guard pre-deployed, despite intelligence warnings and President Trump's offers of troops that were ignored under her leadership as Speaker.
These quotes of Nancy Pelosi claiming responsibility did come from the HBO documentary on the event, and we'll just watch them right here.
They had to recess the session. It's a complete victory for
McGovern's in the chair now and they're proceeding.
Who's in the chair?
Mr. McGovern.
So what's the prospect? We're going to stay here all day, the rest of our lives, or what? We're here until what? Until the National Guard decides to come and get rid of these people? Oh my God, I can't believe the stupidity of this. I I'm going to take full responsibility.
Okay, if you think this is her saying that she caused the riot, or it was somehow her fault that the Capitol wasn't properly secured, no, anybody who isn't an autistic retard understands that this is more of a generalized statement of how the fuck did things get so bad. The conspiracy theory that Nancy Pelosi refused the National Guard somehow is a stupid one, but you do see it all over right-wing Twitter and YouTube.
When we get to what happened on January 6th, we have to remember that 3 weeks before January 6th, Nancy Pelosi and Mitch McConnell changed the law. They made it to where Chief Sund, the Capitol Police Chief, could not invoke the National Guard at will. He had to file paperwork now because they changed the law. Okay? So when he files the paperwork asking for the National Guard, Nancy Pelosi and Mitch McConnell say no. Why do they say no? Because bad optics and because there's no need. There's no paperwork that says we need the National Guard there. Now, Yogananda Pittman, who Tariq Johnson actually has blown the whistle on this woman, she's in charge of intelligence in Capitol Police. Okay. She had the intelligence from Mark Milley in the Pentagon that there was going to be over a dozen known terrorists in the crowd. She sat on it. She apparently had information that the Oath Keepers and the Proud Boys were going to do something. She sat on it. She didn't get it to Chief Sund. Why? Well, because she's friends with Nancy Pelosi. And because that paperwork being in his official file for the request of the National Guard would have got the National Guard there.
Yes, this is from Tim Pool's podcast. And no, none of it is true. Here's why these dumb fucks blame Pelosi. The United States Capitol Police, or the USCP, sometimes just the CP, which is a terrible acronym, are a police force specifically tasked with policing and protecting Congress and the surrounding grounds. The Capitol Police are controlled by a 3-man board, consisting of the Sergeant-at-Arms of the House, the Sergeant-at-Arms of the Senate, and the Architect of the Capitol. The Sergeant-at-Arms of the House is appointed by the Speaker of the House. The Sergeant-at-Arms of the House during January 6th was Paul Irving, who was appointed to the position on January 17th, 2012 by then Speaker of the House John Boehner, who was a Republican. Though the Sergeant-at-Arms is appointed by the Speaker, he does not answer to the Speaker directly, and has significant leeway to perform his job. He can resign or be impeached, or the Speaker has the opportunity to unilaterally change him out once every 2 years, but he's not directly under the Speaker's control. Now that we have all of this information, it becomes obvious just how many ways this idea that Nancy Pelosi refused the National Guard is just false. 1. Nancy Pelosi does not control the Sergeant-at-Arms. She only appoints him. She can't direct him, she doesn't control him. 2. The USCP is not controlled by the Sergeant-at-Arms, or by the House Speaker, directly or indirectly. Pelosi only has the ability to appoint one of the 3 seats once every 2 years, and has no influence over the other 2 seats. Even if you somehow believe that the appointer has some sort of hidden influence over the appointee, the Sergeant-at-Arms during January 6th wasn't appointed by Pelosi. He was a holdover from a previous Republican administration. And 4, most damningly of all, the US Capitol Police's authority is not actually required to deploy the National Guard in DC or at Congress. That authority is the president's, which by the way Trump has proven recently, by unilaterally deploying the National Guard in other areas of the country without the consent of their local officials. In fact, the actual reason the DC National Guard was not deployed right away was not due to anything that Pelosi did, but rather a change in policy from the White House. Major General William Walker, the head of the DC National Guard, testified under oath that on January 5th, one day before the riot, a notice came down the pipe stating that before he would be allowed to deploy his men, he needed express approval from the Secretary of the Army as well as the Secretary of Defense, a change in policy that made it significantly harder for the DC National Guard to assist. In other words, it wasn't Pelosi the Democrats, it was a change in White House policy that prevented the National Guard from showing up and helping. The website continues.
The Democrats masterfully reversed reality after January 6th, branding peaceful patriotic protesters as insurrectionists and framing the event as a violent coup attempt orchestrated by Trump, despite no evidence of armed rebellion or intent to overthrow the government. In truth, it was the Democrats who staged the real insurrection by certifying a fraud-ridden election, ignoring widespread irregularities, and weaponizing federal agencies to hunt down dissenters, all while Pelosi's own security lapses invited the chaos they later exploited to seize and consolidate power. This gaslighting narrative allowed them to persecute innocent Americans, silence opposition, and distract from their own role in undermining democracy.
Every single sentence, every word in this paragraph is just wrong. Trump and his cronies are literally doing the thing where you accuse your opponents of that which you're guilty. There were violent rioters at the Capitol. They were there to pressure Pence into accepting the false electors. Pelosi didn't cause the lapse in security, the Trump administration did. This paragraph accuses the Democrats of gaslighting while doing a ton of its own. And yeah, all of those 2020 election investigations turned up nothing. All the viral stories were fake. The water leak that apparently flooded a polling center, and the Democrats used it to sneak in fake ballots or whatever? If you actually look at that, it was a burst water pipe, and the venue didn't actually close. The mysterious case of ballots appearing from under the desk? Yeah, if you look at that, those are real ballots. They're in a sealed case, so they're not tampered with. They were being stored there until it was time to count them, since it takes time to count ballots, and you gotta put them somewhere in the meantime. And no, they weren't pulled out after poll workers were told to go home. The poll workers in fact came back in to watch these ballots being counted. Each of these stories got amplified by the megaphone of big right-wing Twitter aggregators and influencers and talking heads, including Trump himself just brazenly repeating lies, the game of telephone passing them around the internet, making the stories crazier and crazier until they were totally divorced from reality. Back on that government page after this is the timeline of events, and this thing is filled with just as many falsehoods. The timeline begins before the riot, where Trump invites Americans to DC and gives the Ellips speech.
At the Ellips, President Trump speaks to hundreds of thousands of supporters, detailing evidence of election fraud and urging the crowd to march to the Capitol to peacefully and patriotically make their voices heard. He stresses the need to fight for the country through strength and determination, explicitly calling for peaceful protest. The crowd responds with massive enthusiasm.
While it is true that Trump's speech at the Ellips used the phrase, peacefully and patriotically make your voices heard, he also said, you need to fight like hell, or you're not going to have a country anymore, as well as, we need to pressure Mike Pence into doing the right thing, meaning rejecting the vote and installing Trump as president. And for those of you Trump supporters who say that the more violent-oriented rhetoric is just a turn of phrase, well, why? If the election was actually stolen from Trump, should you guys not be violent? Like here, let's assume an alternate reality where the Democrats actually did steal 2020, and the protest at the Capitol building was 100% peaceful. Do you know what would have happened? Nothing. The Democrats would have gotten away with it. If there actually is a real deep state stealing elections, your only recourse at that point is political violence. So either Trump was calling for violence that from his point of view was righteous, or he's a cucked fucking loser. Which is it? At 1 p.m., the Patriots march to the Capitol.
Following the president's speech, the massive crowd peacefully marches down Constitution Avenue to the Capitol to protest the certification of the fraudulent election. The march is orderly and spirited, with flags, signs, and chants supporting President Trump.
The riot had already broken out at this point, and people who were on the way there were getting angry, as they had heard over the internet that Pence had already rejected Trump's false elector plan.
Mike Pence, I hope you're going to stand up for the good of our Constitution and for the good of our country. And if you're not, I'm going to be very disappointed in you. I will tell you right now.
I'm telling you what, I'm hearing the Pence just caved.
No.
Is that true? I'm hearing reports that Pence caved.
No
I'm
way.
telling you, if Pence caved, we're going to drag through the streets. You politicians are going to get drugged through the streets.
Yes.
I guess the hope is that there's such a show of force here that Pence will decide to do the right thing, according to Trump.
The next entry, security failures, is labeled from 1:10 p.m. to 3 p.m., meaning that yes, they do accept these events overlap somewhat.
Capitol Police aggressively fire tear gas, flashbangs, and rubber munitions into crowds of peaceful protesters, injuring many and deliberately escalating tensions. Video evidence shows officers inexplicably removing barricades, opening Capitol doors, and even waving attendees inside the building, actions that facilitated entry, while simultaneously deploying violent force against others. These inconsistent and provocative tactics turned a peaceful demonstration into chaos.
When the Capitol Police began to use tear gas, flashbangs, and rubber bullets on the ground, the crowd had already violently pushed through 2 barricades, and they were attempting to breach the final perimeter into the Capitol building. The narrative that officers inexplicably removed barricades is false. That comes from various viral clips of officers waving at other officers, telling them to fall back because the current barricade had already been overrun. These officers are not waving in protesters. Additionally, the claim that officers allowed the rioters into the building is also false. It's not hard to find the footage of the Proud Boys breaking in through the windows, entering the building, and then opening doors from the inside. What this passage is referring to is, once again, a viral clip, where a rioter who already made it in through one entrance is attempting to open a door on another side of the building to let in more rioters. There's no evidence of some Capitol Police insider, a fact that was litigated to death during the long and legendary Maglocks debate that I was a part of. Here is what is, in my opinion, the scummiest entry on this timeline. Labeled as being from 2:24 p.m. to 4:17 p.m., Trump urges calm.
As events unfold, President Trump repeatedly calls for peace, tweeting support for law enforcement and releasing a video telling supporters, "Go home in peace," while reiterating love for them and election concerns. He consistently promotes nonviolence despite the attack on attendees and emotions running high.
Want to know why these timestamps are so weird? Well, at 2:24 p.m., Trump tweeted, "Mike Pence didn't have the courage to do what should have been done to protect our country and our Constitution, giving the states a chance to certify a corrected set of facts, not the fraudulent or inaccurate ones which they were asked to previously certify. USA demands the truth." This is not a message from Trump urging peace or supporting law enforcement. This is Trump further riling up the crowd by informing his supporters that Mike Pence has refused to install him as president. Now, to Trump's credit, he did put out 2 additional tweets at 2:38 and 3:13, supporting the police and asking people to remain peaceful. But at this point, it's too little too late. The Capitol's already been breached. Pence and the legislators have been successfully evacuated. The possibility that Trump's goals are achieved here, that the crowd successfully pressures Pence into accepting the false electors, is no longer on the table. So, these 2 tweets are more likely to be Trump trying to cover his ass, when an actual responsible president would have stated this stuff from the get-go and repeated it constantly. By 4:17 p.m., the screenshot says 9:17 because a British person made it, Trump finally posted this video.
"I know your pain. I know you're hurt. We had an election that was stolen from us. It was a landslide election, and everyone knows it, especially the other side. But you have to go home now. We have to have peace. We have to have law and order. We have to respect our great people in law and order. We don't want anybody hurt. It's a very tough period of time. There's never been a time like this where such a thing happened, where they could take it away from all of us, from me, from you, from our country. This was a fraudulent election, but we can't play into the hands of these people. We have to have peace. So go home. We love you. You're very special. You've seen what happens. You see the way others are treated that are so bad and so evil. I know how you feel, but go home and go home in peace."
This is the go home in peace thing. But he's still saying the election was stolen when it wasn't. And he knew it wasn't. Again, watch my J6 video. The evidence shows that he was lying. And Trump has continued to lie about this all the way up to today. The next section is on the Pelosi security claim, which we've already gone over, so let's jump ahead to Ashley Babbitt's death.
Unarmed Air Force veteran and Trump supporter Ashley Babbitt is fatally shot by Capitol Police Lieutenant Michael Byrd without warning as she climbs through a broken window toward the Speaker's lobby. No weapon was found on her, and she posed no threat. Byrd faced no charges. 3 other Americans were also killed: Roseanne Boyland, Kevin Greason, and Benjamin Phillips. 0 law enforcement officers lost their lives.
Now, it's actually not hard at all to find the video of Ashley Babbitt's death. The rioters were attempting to breach through a makeshift barricade set up by congressmen who were still stuck inside the building. Eventually, one of the windows is broken, and the first person through that window is Ashley Babbitt, who is shot and killed by a Capitol Police officer behind the barricade, an officer who was doing his duty, protecting the congressman from the riot. The reason he was not charged with anything is because this is an obviously justified shooting. It doesn't matter that she's a woman or if you agree with her politics or whatever. Right-wingers have said consistently, do not aggressively approach the cops. You need to follow orders and have your day in court. Fuck around, find out. And you know what? Babbitt fucked around and found out. The next entry skips ahead to 8 p.m.
Vice President Mike Pence, who had the opportunity to return disputed electoral slates to state legislatures for review and decertification under the United States Constitution, chooses not to exercise that power in an act of cowardice and sabotage. Instead, Pence presides over the certification of contested electors, undermining President Trump's efforts to address documented fraud and ending any chance to correct the election steal.
I sound like a broken record here, but this is again something I went over previously in the J6 video, so I won't take too long here. Pence did not actually have the authority to do what he claims here, to return the disputed electors back to the state legislatures. This idea came from John Eastman, a Trump lawyer, who wrote the now infamous Eastman memo. Eastman believed the Electoral Count Act was unconstitutional, and therefore Pence should simply violate that law. His reasoning is the precedent set by Jefferson in the 1800 election, where Eastman claimed that Jefferson unilaterally decided on the validity of Georgia's electors. But this isn't true. What actually happened is that the state of Georgia was, at the time, suffering from a paper shortage, and as a result, part of the contents of the elector ballot was written on the envelope it arrived in. The congressional clerks made note of the discrepancy in the official congressional record, and then Jefferson properly counted the vote. This action was not Jefferson unilaterally overruling an objection from Congress or whatever. And by the way, you can actually view these electors in question in the National Archives. They're publicly available upon request. Next up is Stolen Election Certified.
After law enforcement clears the Capitol, Congress reconvenes late that night and certifies Joe Biden's electoral votes. Votes from battleground states marred by massive mail-in ballot fraud, hidden suitcases of ballots, exploding water pipes, voting machine irregularities, and unprecedented pandemic-era rule changes that bypass state legislatures. 2020 is considered the greatest election theft in U.S. history, with widespread fraud deliberately ignored by courts, officials, and the media.
Once again, there's no evidence of mail-in ballot fraud. The hidden suitcases of ballots were legitimate, there was one broken water pipe that did not shut down the voting process, but the interesting claim here is the unprecedented pandemic-era rule changes that bypass the state legislatures. What Trump is referring to here is Act 77 out of Pennsylvania. On October 31st, 2019, months before COVID, keep in mind, the Pennsylvania state legislature passed Act 77, which changed the law to make mail-in voting easier. Now, if the complaint about this rule change was actually made in good faith, Trump's lawsuits against them would have been filed sometime between October 31st, 2019 and the election. However, his campaign only filed after Trump had lost. The changes brought forward in Act 77 were ultimately struck down by the Pennsylvania courts in 2022, and that decision was reversed by the Supreme Court in August of 2022. This legal back and forth over whether or not these new rules were constitutional was a story that was, once again, amplified across the internet by large right-wing figures during Biden's term, with the game of telephone to cause the story to become more and more outlandish, until finally ending up in Trump's ear. Here's the first post-J6 event on the timeline.
Despite his explicit calls for peaceful protest, Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, and other platforms collude to ban President Trump, citing incitement and a blatant act of election interference. JP Morgan, Bank of America, Capital One, and other major financial institutions debank President Trump and his family, closing accounts, freezing funds, and denying services in a ruthless campaign of financial persecution to destroy them politically and economically. Legacy media suppresses evidence of fraud.
Not gonna lie, I personally haven't heard of Trump himself getting debanked. I know that right-wing influencers have been debanked before, so maybe he's just playing up a talking point here. More importantly, though, I don't know how this could possibly be election interference for Trump to be banned from social media after the election's fucking over. After that is the mass arrests entry, which we already covered, so let's just skip it, and move on to the J6 committee.
Speaker Pelosi's hand-picked January 6th Select Committee, stacked with anti-Trump Democrats and two rhinos, Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger, spent over 3 years and nearly $20 million in taxpayer funds on a propaganda spectacle to demonize President Trump and his supporters. They coached witnesses like Cassidy Hutchinson, leading to calls for perjury and witness tampering investigations against them, while withholding exculpatory evidence, deleting encrypted files, and ignoring security failures.
Once again, we've covered this before, but I do want to touch on the Cassidy Hutchinson stuff real quick, since I didn't talk about that in my J6 video. Cassidy Hutchinson was an aide to Trump's chief of staff, Mark Meadows, and she provided under-oath testimony to the J6 committee. Trumpsters commonly say that Hutchinson was witness tampered by Liz Cheney, and this means that her testimony is all fake and needs to be discarded, and Cheney should be arrested, and the entire J6 committee is illegitimate as well. The claim varies based on whoever you ask. What actually happened is that Hutchinson was provided a lawyer, Stefan Passantino, secretly paid for by the Trump PAC Save America. I don't know if that's what PAC money can legally be used for, but alright, whatever. Passantino had a long career working with Trump on various projects, and he told Hutchinson to give the J6 committee misleading testimony. Meadows contacted Hutchinson before her deposition and said that he knew she was loyal and that she was going to do the right thing tomorrow and protect him and Trump. Hutchinson began to suspect that Passantino was leaking her testimony to Trump's team, a charge which he denies. Now, the reason that the MAGA-tards say that these series of events are witness tampering by Liz Cheney, rather than, witness tampering by the Trump campaign, is because of the circumstances surrounding Hutchinson dropping Passantino. By April of 2022, Hutchinson was deep in the Trump camp. All of her personal and professional relationships were with people in Trump's team. She felt as if she was being asked to not tell the whole truth by her lawyer, and so she reached out to the only contact she had left, who was outside of the Trump cult, Alyssa Farah Griffin, Trump's director of communications, who had left Team Trump after the J6 riot. I'll put the transcript of Hutchinson and Farah's conversation on screen if you want to read it, but basically, Hutchinson admits she doesn't trust her Trump-approved lawyer and asks Farah to back-channel with the committee for her, so that Passantino doesn't know that she wants to say more than she currently is. It's this interaction that leads to Hutchinson texting Liz Cheney directly on June 6, 2022. And by June 9, 2022, Hutchinson had fired Passantino and replaced him with Jody Hunt, a GOP lawyer who previously worked under Trump's former AGs William Barr and Jeff Sessions. Afterward, Hutchinson's testimony to the J6 committee was significantly more open and enlightening. This is the so-called witness tampering that MAGA wants you to believe happened, that Hutchinson, feeling the pressure from the Trump camp, reached out to the only non-Trump contact she had, And because that led her to talking to Liz Cheney, that means she had somehow been tampered with by Cheney. Except that's not the case at all. There's no evidence that Cheney told Hutchinson what to say, or coached her, or whatever. That all came from Passantino and Meadows. No, the people who believe this theory, if you can ever actually get them to have a rational conversation, will eventually point at some vague feeling of impropriety that a witness to the committee should not be talking to a chair of that same committee, in back channels, without her lawyer present. And you know what? To a layman's sensibilities, I can see why that appears sus. But it turns out there's no ethics rule for the House committees that prohibit this kind of contact, especially since Hutchinson clearly gave her consent to be spoken to without her lawyer present, since she was, suspicious of him. That is the most important part. It is absolutely a witness's right to have a lawyer present when they testify, but it's also their right to waive it if they so choose. This is why the Republican Oversight Committee, claiming there was some ethical violation here, that Hutchinson texted Cheney, or that Hutchinson got a different lawyer, doesn't actually hold any water. Liz Cheney didn't do anything wrong. At every step of the way, Hutchinson consented and was the proactive party. The next step on the timeline is the weaponized prosecutions against Trump.
Biden prosecutors bring multiple indictments against President Trump over his legal election challenges, including January 6 related federal charges. FBI agents conduct an unprecedented raid on his Mar-a-Lago home, including searching through First Lady Melania Trump's private wardrobe and personal belongings. They target his loyal lawyers, aides, and associates with baseless charges, threatening decades-long prison sentences to pressure them into flipping with false testimony against him.
Once again, there's no evidence that anyone who flipped on Trump gave false testimony, and Trump is deliberately muddying the waters here between the multiple cases against him. For example, the Mar-a-Lago case has nothing to do with January 6th, and everything to do with Trump willfully withholding classified documents at Mar-a-Lago. And before I hear the tired whataboutism of other presidents doing it too, every other president immediately returned classified documents when requested, because they didn't actually mean to retain them, and intent is a part of the law here. Meanwhile, Trump lied to the FBI about not having documents when he actually had them, repeatedly telling the FBI he didn't have anything, while at the same time texting his lawyer that he had them. And speaking of the FBI, they're the next timeline point.
Subsequent investigations, congressional testimony, DOJ admissions, and whistleblowers confirm the FBI had at least 26, and likely dozens more, confidential informants and assets embedded in the January 6th crowd. Figures like Ray Epps, who was caught on video repeatedly urging people to go into the Capitol, were charged only minimally. Democrats successfully flipped the narrative to brand peaceful protesters as insurrectionists, while waging the true insurrection against a legitimate election.
Even if we assume this is true, these informants do not excuse the actions of the 1,600 lawbreakers at the Capitol on January 6th. These guys are their own person. They are responsible for their own actions. Also, if Ray Epps was actually responsible here, Trump, why'd you fucking pardon him? And finally, lawfare fails, Trump prevails.
Despite relentless deep state efforts to imprison, bankrupt, and assassinate him, all designed to sabotage his political comeback through fabricated indictments, invasive raids, and rigged show trials, President Trump emerges triumphant. Fueled by unbreakable resolve, the fierce loyalty of his courageous family, team, and patriotic Americans, and God's unmistakable grace, he delivers a landslide 2024 victory and reclaims the White House in the greatest comeback in American history.
In actuality, the only reason that Trump got away with all of his crimes is because he won the 2024 election. That's it. Right-wing talking heads managed to mind rape enough rank-and-file Republicans into voting for Trump yet again by shamelessly promoting this intricate tapestry of lies for 4 years straight, while frankly, the Democrats ran a weak candidate against him. The reason that Jack Smith's indictment was granted dismissal without prejudice is because the evidence against Trump is solid, and Trump's presidential immunity ends when he leaves office. Without prejudice means the cases can be filed again in the future. And I hope they are. It is not, as the timeline states, because it was all actually lawfare and Trump is actually innocent of all charges and there's no evidence against him. What this page ultimately is regime propaganda. It's Trump rewriting the history behind his coup attempt 5 years after the fact. In a weird way, Trump is actually keeping the J6 conversation alive by doing this. The J6 riot certainly isn't a current piece of news. If you want criticisms of Trump that are actually relevant in 2026, there are lots of them, but this ain't it. But Trump publishing this page has brought the story back into the limelight. And as a result, I actually had the opportunity to be on a pretty high-profile panel, diving into the details of this timeline and what it gets wrong. So hey, consider watching that if you're interested. The page does continue further, but after the timeline section, it's really just restating what we've already gone over in more detail, so there's not actually much to say about it. I am happy that Trump put this shit out though. One, it's an additional piece of evidence that Trump is willing to lie and rewrite history in order to suit his agenda, like any other dictator would. And two, because when I eventually, one day, put out the second and third parts to my J6 trilogy of videos, I can now use this page page as a reference, comparing what the Trump propaganda has said to what actually happened. It's quite handy to have all these conspiracy theories in one easily accessible place, rather than having to run around social media and collect all this unhidden shit that people actually believed. Anyway, Trump is a tyrant, and the only way for justice to be served now is for the Democrats to win as hard as possible in the next election, and then put this guy behind bars for the rest of his life. Let's hope.